I want to thank our friend Rajit Kumar for his important and continuous support for Stages of Freedom. We want to also thank Darius Henderson Jr. for managing the Zoom this early evening. Rob Dimmick, co-founder of Stages of Freedom, and Constance Jordan and Cheryl Jordan are two leading board members and former Detroiters. Join me in welcoming you to this very important evening. I'm Ray Rickman, co-founder of the Stages of Freedom with Rob Dimmick. We exist to give real people chances to meet people like James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, David Blight, all in person. And this fall, Henry Louis Gates. And this evening, with the power of Zoom, Elizabeth Anderson. You saw her resume. I want you to know that Elizabeth Anderson is one of the most exciting philosophy professors in America. No, I'm wrong, in the world. We welcome her to spend an hour with us in Providence tonight. She's in Ann Arbor, once my favorite city in the world, until I got to go to Paris. Elizabeth Anderson.
It's a tremendous pleasure to be able to speak to everyone today at Stages of Freedom, and it's a great honor to be able to address you. I'm just going to share my screen right now. I just have a few slides to lay out the basic ideas of the reasons to pursue racial integration in the United States. So this is not going to be a complete story, but I think it will raise enough ideas to get a conversation going. What you see here is a dot map of Chicago, which there's a dot for every 200 people, and the color of the dot represents the race of the people in various areas of Chicago. So you can see here that in north of Chicago is overwhelmingly white, South Chicago is overwhelmingly Black. Latinos are in the middle here. There are very striking patterns of racial segregation that look across the United States. In major metropolitan areas, you would see the same striking differences, racial segregation. If you looked at New York City or Detroit, most major metropolitan areas look like this. The other thing to keep in mind is that this racial segregation also corresponds to dramatic inequalities, with the white areas being vastly more prosperous and better off on virtually every measure of well-being than the Black areas. So just to give you one measure, to give you a sense of the drastic inequalities involved in segregation, there's a 30-year difference in life expectancy between the long-lived white districts in northern Chicago compared to South Chicago, where we have an almost entirely Black population. Why is that? Why does segregation cause inequality? It's a really complicated story, and I can only give you some pieces of that story. But segregation of residences creates a kind of vicious. And the reason for this is that whites are segregated, of course, but they've segregated around the monopolization of certain critical resources for success, things like jobs, for instance, and education, excellent schools. So if we with segregation here, and here we're thinking now of the impact of segregation on people, on Blacks living in segregated Black neighborhoods. One consequence is known as spatial mismatch. That means that they're living in places where there isn't job growth, jobs are else. It's much harder for them to get to where the jobs are, much harder for them to find out about those jobs. And hence you tend to get concentrated unemployment and poverty. And that means that their locale has a lower tax base, they get worse public services. Even if there's an integrated space in Chicago, it's still the case that cities find a way to channel better resources, for instance, more experienced teachers to schools primarily attended by white students. And so if they live in a highly segregated, mostly Black city like Detroit, where I lived for several years, you also see shockingly high tax rates, which are needed to support the schools because the housing values are low. Businesses tend to leave. It's really hard to do a lot of shopping in Detroit. Many people have to go to the suburbs to find shopping. And white flight too, and of course that means a flight of resources, of wealth, and so forth. The schools then tend to be poorly funded and they have difficulty competing for the best teachers. And so you tend to get lower school achievement. And that all together leads to lower housing values because one of the major costs of housing is the associated school district and how high achieving the schools are. Here's another thing that happens, and this is the impact of segregation and consequent inequality on how segregated people are viewed. Okay, and the result of this is stigma and discrimination. So if we start with people who have been segregated away from important opportunities, okay, and consequently they suffer racial inequality. And this story is not unique to African Americans. Other people of color suffer, although to a lesser degree, from racial segregation. But nevertheless, I think the case is strongest for Blacks because of the intensity of segregation. So they suffer from racial inequality, higher rates of unemployment, less school achievement, and so forth. And that leads to stereotypes. Okay, racial stereotypes. That is, it's assumed that a prospective employer assumes that a Black person who's graduated from high school didn't graduate with as much academic ability as a white person who probably went to a school with better teachers. And so those stereotypes lead then to differential treatment, okay, discrimination on the basis of those stereotypes. And then, in fact, then Blacks respond differently to that discrimination. And we get a stigmatic explanation of this whole complex of responses. That is, the tendency is, it's a psychological tendency when privileged groups look upon disadvantaged groups to assume that anything negative about their circumstances is really due to some personal defect. Okay, so a high school dropout and they're Black, the assumption is there's like something wrong with them rather than that they were assigned to a school that didn't serve their needs. And that kind of discrimination and stigmatization reinforces segregation. Okay, so we have a vicious circle here. I want to especially stress the impact of segregation on white consciousness, on white understandings and stories that whites tell about Blacks. I think that as a result of segregation, whites suffer from various cognitive and emotional deficits in interacting with Blacks that reinforces the injustices that we already see, starting off with segregation of neighborhoods and housing. And what are they? Well, one is ignorance, right? I mean, if whites are living apart in totally different neighborhoods and cities, they're not really going to know much about the circumstances of Blacks and what Black people go through. Okay. And that, as I pointed out last time, leads to all kinds of stigmatizing stereotypes. Whites have a tendency to assume that if something's going wrong in Blacks' lives, it must be something wrong with them rather than with their circumstances. It's very difficult for whites to project themselves into the shoes of Black people, okay? And that kind of imagination is necessary for empathy. So whites have lower empathy for Black and less understanding of their complaints and their predicaments. And that also tends to lead, the stigmatizing stereotypes lead to a lack of skill in respectful and culturally competent interaction. So we just have a pile-on of problematic interactions that ultimately result in discrimination. Put all together, what this means is that whites tend to be inadequately responsive to Black people's concerns. And since whites in most places hold a lot of power, that has a major negative impact on Black people's lives, especially political power. Here we can see a couple of examples of what I think are probably explained by stereotype, stigmatization, and lack of empathy when white healthcare providers are providing healthcare to people. They're not trying to be mean. But look at what we find here. The latest research shows that Black doctors are better at keeping Black men healthy. And in particular, they're better able to persuade Black men to take preventative measures, preventative health care. Another study that found that the mortality rate for Black babies is cut dramatically when Black doctors are caring for them after birth. Okay, so there's some knowledge and probably linked to empathy that Black doctors have. And some of these are women, Black women who've been through their pregnancy and knew what it was like. And so they have knowledge and empathy that enables them to save Black lives. So what does integration have to do with this? I want to link the ideal of integration to Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideal of the beloved community and tie that together with democracy understood as a way of life. If segregation is a problem, then we should expect that integration, racial integration, is a remedy. But now we define integration carefully. And so I'm going to define it this way, that integration, racial integration, any kind of integration by religion, whatever it might be, consists in full participation on terms of equality of people from all walks of life in civil society. So the idea is that people are interacting, people of diverse social identities, diverse occupations, diverse religions, on all dimensions of diversity. They're meeting in civil society and employment and businesses, on the streets and politics and so forth. And they're meeting and interacting on terms of equality, where there's no stigmatization, there's no contempt, right? People, there's mutual respect, okay? And that is, I'm going to define as integration. So integration can't be reduced to just mere bodies in space that are next to each other, right? Integration is a matter of social relationships that we have to each other, relationships of mutual respect and equality. Now, as it happens, democracy is a way of life and not just a machinery of elections, okay? Then democracy itself requires sustained interaction of citizens from different walks of life with each other, where we talk about the issues of the day and we learn about each other's predicaments, see whether we share some problems that need public address, okay? We talk about our experiences. Well, that requires interaction of citizens as equals so that we actually seriously listen to each other, seriously talk and get real about our experiences. And here's, I think, a lovely quote from the legal academic Robert Post, who I think encapsulated this idea quite effectively. He said, "The capacity to regard oneself from the perspective of the other is the foundation of the critical interaction necessary for active and effective citizenship." So what I want to suggest is that this ideal of racial integration is really central to democracy itself, to an effective democracy that's responsive to everybody's concerns. And now I just want to show in a kind of micro scale what this looks like, and draw on the wonderful research by Samuel Summers, who has taken a look at juries and compared the performance of racially integrated juries with all white juries. So he selected them from people who'd been called for jury duty right here in Washtenaw County, Michigan. And he divided them up into all white juries and mixed race juries, okay, integrated juries. And he gave them a case of a film of a trial of a Black man who was a defendant for a crime that he was accused of committing against a white person. And then he mic'd the room and he wanted to find out how they deliberated. And what he was that racially integrated juries were more responsible, more thoughtful, more accurate on every measure you could imagine. So they deliberated longer, they were more thoughtful, they weren't rushing to judgment. The racially integrated juries considered more facts raised in the trial. They made fewer inaccurate statements, right? They're more accurate. They remember things better. If somebody misremembered something and stated a falsehood, they would be more likely to correct the falsehood and have everybody recall accurately what really happened. They were very sensitive to what you might call missing evidence, much more sensitive than the all-white juries. That is, they would ask, well, if this guy's really guilty, how come they didn't present evidence of this and that nature? But the prosecution never presented evidence like that. So that raises some doubts about whether this guy is actually guilty. And here's the most important effect of racial integration on juries. They were far more likely to discuss and take seriously the possibility that racial factors had influenced the way the trial went or the whole criminal justice process. Like, were the police racist in arresting this guy? Was the eyewitness or the victim who was white, able to discriminate among different Black faces? And what I find most striking about his findings was that whites on integrated juries were far more likely to raise the possibility that race or racism was a factor that was negatively impacting the defendant than whites in all white juries. So somehow the presence of Black people activated in whites a recognition that racism is a factor that unjustly affects Blacks, whereas in all white juries, it was much less likely for anyone to raise the issue. And when they did, they would be immediately slapped down saying, we're not putting the trial, it's this guy is on trial, right? And so we never got serious uptake. And I think integration explains this because we do know in any kind of democratic deliberation where there's going to be a vote, that if a policy is being hashed out or a decision is being hashed out, the costs tend to lay on the people who are not in the room, right? People in the room, there's a kind of accountability effect, okay? And it actually makes white people more accountable, more epistemically responsible when they're making decisions that have a profound impact on the lives of Black people. So this is just an illustration And what do we make of it? Well, I think that gives us a sign of hope that a better world is possible. So I'll leave you there.
This is fascinating. Let me, this is a tough question, Elizabeth Anderson. I have maybe 20 times in my life been confronted by police, and I was innocent every single time.
Yeah.
Now, the very first time I was arrested with my best friend, John Murphy, who is now a judge. He's going to retire in a month or so, but he's a judge in Wayne County, 10 miles from you. And he's one of the most honorable people in the world. And the two of us, as 8-year-olds, got arrested for looking through a chain link fence, 12 feet tall, into a boatyard. And, I was the skinniest little kid in the world. John wasn't. John couldn't climb the fence, and I probably couldn't either. And they arrested us and took us downtown, and the only thing saved us from even getting processed is that a black cop, this is Detroit, where black cops were probably 2% of the whole population, even though the city was 50-60% then. And he said, "What did they do?" And the cop who arrested us couldn't quite explain it. And he just took us, put us in the car and took us home. That was my first arrest. And I'll give you my second one. In the department store, Loveman's department store, biggest department store in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, my mother was arrested for trying on a hat. Now, she knew better because she grew up there. But when you're away for a while, you forget. And they arrested my mother and chained me to some stairs until my aunt came to get me. Actually, it's reverse. I was 7 when that happened and 8 when we got arrested. We're looking at boats through a fence. Now that's how and I got 20 more of these. I will bet every other black man of my age has these. And every other Black Latino man, 18 years old, has them too. They're a little different now. These police officers are racist. I'm sorry, when I was a kid, they were racist. No question about it. Now everyone pretends almost all police officers are good people, are not racist, and we just have an incident, including horrible ones, every 6 weeks. I wanted you to respond to this because I am the same person, maybe a better person. I got to be careful now, but I've worked on being more, being a feminist, all these things that I came to in adulthood. I work on being a broad-minded person. I'm now trying to be more liberal on transgender things. I've never been a conservative or anti, but now I'm trying to really be cool and helpful. I work at it. Now, this is a long question because I want you to respond. I am the same person when I was 7 or certainly 17 that I am now. Aren't most of these people who were bad, racist, sexist, homophobe, don't they still have that in their character and it pops out all the time, but not as publicly because they get in trouble sometimes now?
Elizabeth, if you could stop share of your screen, then we can see you.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah. So I guess I'm disinclined to see everybody who behaves in a racist way as fundamentally racist in their character and hence, in some sense, unable to change. No doubt there are some people like this, but I also see remarkable cases of people who have changed quite dramatically. So there was a wonderful story, and unfortunately I can't remember his name, but of a young man who was being groomed to be part of this deep racist white supremacist group, and he was on the radio all the time, and he was going to be the next leader of this group. but he went off to college. And at college, he knew that most undergraduates are liberal. And so he kind of kept his head down. But other people rapidly found out that he was one of these white supremacists spewing all kinds of racist stuff on the radio. Now, what was interesting about the college students' response was that instead of ostracizing him, they invited him to dinner and they started engaging him. And, you know, and then they invited people of different races in, you know, to have dinner. And, you know, he realized that all the stuff he'd been taught by his parents and by this racist group was just garbage. And he just repeated everything. I do think that redemption is possible. Now, of course, it can be difficult. And I do think police officers are especially difficult to reform because police departments basically have a culture of bullies. I mean, within the department, the most racist police officers tend to bully anybody who wants to be just. And there's a kind of intimidation factor there. And also police departments are pervaded by fear. And I think it's impossible to exaggerate how much fear lies behind police violence. And so, right, I agree with you that it's an incredibly difficult problem of injustice, but I'm very confident that if we can find out a way to ramp the fear of police officers, you're going to see a lot less violence.
So we had a young man who worked for Stages of Freedom, came to us with very conservative views, and I'll leave it at that. And over a 4-year period, he has changed. But that's with almost hands-on and talking, get him to read the New York Times instead of what he was reading. Oh, I can't even tell you what he's reading. But his parents are racist. His grandparents are Ku Klux Klan's members. I mean, they're just, and I say to myself, how many people can I work with like that? Now, I'm criticized all the time because the two leading arch conservatives in Rhode Island, I make it my business to call them, go on their radio shows. And I have them, I think I've got them down from 10, you know, they're president of the Klan. Well, they were only 8s or 9s. And I might have them to 7 because they're actually willing. But I'd have to go to dinner with them every night because the minute I quit talking to them, they're back in the company of really bad people. And so this is a form of a question. Aren't you often, and I think you just said this, but aren't you often who you hang out with and who your mother and father are? And
oh, totally, right? And that's why, right, I think integration is really important, right? If you're only hanging out with racist white people, you're highly likely to be racist, right? But engagement, you know, across racial lines is a fundamental way to break that down. And let's keep in mind that the engagement doesn't have to be focused on, you know, deprogramming a racist. There are all kinds of informal ways that people can interact on sports teams, for instance. Sports teams are one of the greatest integrating forces around. But also you can, you know, play music together, any kind of games. There's all kinds of stuff that people can do together that aren't about making people less racist, but that in fact will make people less racist. Because it breaks down those stereotypes and it makes people less, you know, afraid, more relaxed.
So let me ask one more question, then we'll go to our participant audience. I've done diversity work, conflict avoidance, I mean, really on a grand scale for major universities and every police department within 100 miles of my house. The last year has been very painful for me, the last 7 or 8 months, not because of COVID-19. I wear a double mask. And I'm not even bored yet. But anyway, every other white person I know is talking about doing good in the world. And every other business you encounter and every other university has a written grand plan, anti-racism. I'm not going to name the one that has created a plan. It's just unbelievable. You couldn't do that at Martin Luther King Jr. New College. And they wrote it 6 months ago and they have done nothing. Now that's my experience. People saying they're going to do something. And then the next day they go to work, 100 white employees. Providence is 51% Black and Latino. And most of these businesses, all white employees. And then when the summer comes, they hire 4 interns, all white. And all of these people are in my face and in every other person's face. And they haven't given NAACP $20. Okay, they certainly haven't given Stages of Freedom $20, but they haven't done anything big. You know, that is help somebody get a job and, you know, out of McDonald's and into whatever. So this is a big question for you. You know, I just finished reading your book. It's fascinating. Why can't, and this sounds so naive, but why can't people see that they're not doing anything while promising?
You know, that's like a fabulous question. White people do have a problem with accountability. I just have to say that. You know, there's all this literature now, white fragility and so forth. It's real. This is a real problem. But there's nothing, you know, that's why my last slide is a Black Lives Matter slide, which has Black and white people, Latinos, all together marching. I do think that in many respects, habits are broken down by new generations who have a different experience. So I do think that we're at an important moment where white people in particular have shifted consciousness. You know, we talk about being woke, but in fact, you know, the polling has shown a real shift of opinion. A lot of that is driven by younger people, younger adults. And, you know, I'm the John Dewey Professor of Philosophy, and John Dewey was a firm believer in the education of youth as a fundamental source of positive cultural change. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement is on the cusp of making serious change. But also as a philosopher, a political philosopher, I also recognize, having studied the history of political philosophy, that we have to take a very long view of things. So just to give you an example in another place, the first time a call was made in England for universal male franchise for the vote was in the 1640s, okay? And they didn't get it to around 1900, okay? So we're looking at a real long struggle here that took literally centuries.
So but
nevertheless, it did vindicate, that struggle vindicated Martin Luther King Jr.'s claim that the arc of the universe is long, ends towards justice.
Yes. So we're going to go to our, to Darius. Darius, will you join us?
All right. So the first question is, this is a long one. I have a perhaps unfair implementation / governance question, in particular about the fiscal circle you drew in the first slide. How does one push through the fragmented and privileged structure of Americans' social provision and agenda that requires a consolidation of funding streams and the coordination of rat's nest of competing nonprofit organizations? That's a little wordy.
Ah, yes. Well, I think this is a really big problem. That whole fragmentation, American governance at all levels, both just at the government level and at the nonprofit level, is super fragmented, and it's really hard to kind of join together on larger policies. I can't say that I'm an expert in particular on the nonprofit situation. And I'm also very unhappy with the fact that we have such extreme levels of inequality that now depending on private philanthropy to do the work that government really ought to be doing for people. At least in government, you can have steady funding streams through the tax system and not just rely on random acts of enormous generosity by super billionaires. So I don't really have a good solution to that because I'm not an expert on philanthropy in particular. But yeah, it's a really big problem.
Well, you do know, Darius, I'm jumping in. New York Times has done 2 studies, but there are half a dozen studies that show that when a Black person in particular, but also a Latino, runs a nonprofit, their chance of getting funding is greatly diminished. And when they do get funding, they ask for 50,000, they get 20 every time. And so it makes it very difficult for Black organizations to survive, actually. So in the nonprofit, but the other thing, I think I was alluding to this a little bit ago, Brown University is one of my favorite places in all the world. And it's true of Dartmouth and Harvard and University of Michigan and University of Chicago, those 10 fabulous schools, all in the mid 60s, late 60s, said, we're going to integrate our student body. And every single one of them have come to the 10, 12, 15% racially integrated. Now you go look at Rhode Island, I'm going to be gracious this evening. You go look at 5 other colleges and they're all 1%, 2%, no percent people of color. So it can be done. Brown University is an example of that. And it's a private school. The government didn't make them do it. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of racial integration? These Ivy League?
Yeah, okay. At the Ivies, I think there's really no substitute for just altering our conception of merit. Okay, and so my mental case for affirmative action is that this is meritocratic. Why? Because, the Ivies, the elite schools, what are they doing? They're educating the elite that's going to be governing this country and leading its main institutions, both businesses, nonprofits, and government. And the case I made illustrating with the jury is that organizations that are dominated by white people cannot actually serve the general public effectively and competently. So we see if you have a medical system that's totally dominated by white people, they won't be able to save Black babies. Mm-hmm. We have to understand that there's many dimensions of knowledge and not all of them are tested on standardized tests. Actual knowledge of how to engage a Black patient and persuade them to take preventative medicine. Knowledge of what Black women go through with difficult pregnancies, often drawing from one's own personal experience if one is a Black healthcare worker. That's real, vital knowledge that saves lives. And we see this time and time again. All kinds of knowledge that's rooted in the personal experience of suffering from racism, of living in segregated communities and knowing how tough life is in those communities, that direct knowledge, personal knowledge, is absolutely essential to building institutions and organizations that are responsive to the needs of people who live there and people who suffer racial discrimination. You cannot have a competent elite that is racially segregated, that's just monochrome. Only an integrated elite is capable of competently serving the full diversity of people in society.
Darius?
The next question in particular is, well, it says, thank you for this presentation. Churches and other places of I'm assuming that is supposed to be worship, can be segregated even in communities that appear to be integrated. How can we bridge that divide?
You know, Martin Luther King Jr., I think, once said that Sunday was the most racially segregated day in America. I think it's super important for churches maybe to reach across and have, you know, joint services. I don't know how much this has been done, but is there any activity of churches to reach across in that way? It seems to me that that could be a very positive experience for people.
Yeah, there is, but it's all limited. You know, we go to First Baptist Church in America. We love it because it's not only a church, it's a meeting house. And we have huge integrated crowd every year, honor Maya Angelou. And there have been these things over probably for 40 years, but they're one-shot deals.
Yeah.
You know, and we were thinking about not doing ours this year, and we said, nope, have to do it because there's so little of it going on. To requote Dr. King, he said the 11 o'clock hour is the most segregated hour on the week. And what you just suggested needs to be done. And I got to be quiet because there is so much work to be done. And my theory is everyone should do more than they're doing. Everybody.
Can I just make a suggestion? Again, young people are much more educable than older people. And again, this is just drawn from John Dewey, but all of the evidence on racial integration supports this. Younger the children have integrated experiences, the more open they are for the rest of their lives. The more integrated lives they lead. And so if we're thinking about churches, I would really want to stress youth groups in the church and have them get together, because young people are not so set in their ways. They're more open, curious, right? And then you can break habits at the source, right? Habits of segregation, habits of fear and distrust, right? When the kids are young. It is really hard, much harder to break bad habits of older people.
Darius?
All right. The next question says, thank you so much, Professor Henderson. It seems that often when a few people of color are introduced into an otherwise white community, they can end up feeling tokenized, isolated, and ultimately exploited and excluded. And that the dominant white culture remains intact. Could you talk a little bit more about the specific dynamics and requirements of a true racial integration that actually creates a transformation in culture and avoids perpetuating racial harm?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And one thing is that there's no substitute for a critical mass. A lot of organizations think that they have integrated because they have a token Black person, right, on staff. And that rarely works. You really need a critical mass, a real presence in numbers to get transformation. And, you know, I can't say exactly what number that is, but then the question is, how can people be attracted to communities that are seriously racially mixed and not just in a tokenized way, but with critical masses? And there actually is some interesting research that's been done on that in terms of trying to figure out how to attract home buyers into places that are integrated. And it turns out that a lot of the reasons why white people avoid racially integrated places is not so much that they don't like Black people, is that they have stereotypes, which are often false, about what kinds of public services, quality of schools, and other amenities are available in racially integrated neighborhoods. But once you break down those stereotypes about the place, right, where substantial numbers of Black people live, then they're actually much more enter. Now, again, this is very hard work, and we should have more organizations doing this work. But it is possible.
Shaker Heights.
Yeah. Oak Park, Chicago.
Darius.
All right. The next question. Thank you for this talk and gathering. I teach philosophy at Roger Williams University. George Yancey was my mentor. I am constantly criticized, regardless of what or how or who I teach from every group. As a white woman in the trenches for almost 2 decades, but with much work to do daily, can you explain how even philosophers of race and feminists, particularly F white, can do even more for and in academia as leaders while also taking the back seat? Not asking for you to do the work, only for your experience insights in both communities and in academics, etc.
Yeah, so that's a really big question. And I have to say, I was my department for 5 years. So I did face that. At University of Michigan, there has been a concerted push by the administration to really focus on non-discrimination in hiring. And during my term, we did have a couple of Black philosophers on staff. And the critical thing is you got to listen. Any kind of leadership position, you have to listen carefully and attentively and without being defensive to what everybody on the faculty, and especially Black faculty, are saying to you. And it can be hard sometimes, right, to face that criticism. But then you have to also act. And that means just taking responsibility and not thinking, oh, I'm being attacked and therefore I have to defend myself, but rather that, oh, this person has raised a real problem that needs to be addressed. What can I do to address it? And, if you're at a functional institution, you can ask other people around that organization and enlist the assistance of other people to help you work out whatever the problem is. So you have to call in other people to help you with that task.
Darius.
Okay, next question. Please talk about charter schools. NAACP Providence branch does not support charter schools, but Mayor Alorza endorses them with the argument that they offer choice to BIPOC community. His argument seems to be that not supporting charter schools is racist. Please talk on this.
Aha. Well, it turns out that one of my favorite undergraduates ever did a study of charter schools in the city of Detroit. And she wanted to know whether this whole charter school thing really made sense philosophically at school choice. And what she found was quite stunning. Now, there are there are a small number of very high performing charter schools. But what she discovered was a large majority of them were just for-profit operations ripping off people. And they were riding on the reputation of the very high quality schools, but they had located themselves in what she called school deserts. Remember, people in the city of Detroit tend to be they don't have really great transportation options. And if there's only one school nearby, that's the school they send their kid to. So it's kind of illusory to even talk about school choice. And the schools that located themselves in neighborhoods that had been depopulated, it's the only school around. And they were just exploiting the parents who really didn't have other options. The student of mine she wrote this powerful undergraduate thesis explaining why the charter school movement was not remotely what it was cracked up to be, at least in Detroit. She decided she wanted to be a teacher in Detroit, and lo and behold, in Teach for America, they placed her in one of the very schools that she had been criticizing. She shows up the day before school opens to set up her classroom. Lo and behold, she found no desks, no chairs, no pencils, no paper, no instructional materials, no textbooks, nothing, no chalk. It was a literally bare, empty room. And she asked the teachers, well, what am I supposed to do here? There's nothing here. It's just an room. And because they're all saving money, because they're just like pocketing the money, because it's a for-profit operation. And then when she went to the principal and she says, but where's my curriculum and my textbooks and stuff? And they say, oh, just go on the web and like find stuff. Okay, like that's what it was. So now you can single out and identify certain very high quality charter schools, but the general run of them, I would not open up just to any old charter school. They have to be accountable and very strict accountability standards before you should allow them. And you shouldn't let some for-profit company manage them.
So in Detroit, in Michigan, the legislature, Republican, has dogged and destroyed the Detroit public school system. It's been about
it's a disaster. Yes,
doing it with Du Bois,
Betsy DeVos. That's right. She basically funds the Republican Party in Michigan.
Yes, and she got indicted, but got out of it for bribing them to cut the Detroit school system's budget by 20%. She gave $25,000 to 4 legislators to do that. So I think the charter school question is a big one, and I wish we'd have a real talk in Rhode Island. The Senate voted day before yesterday to put a 3-year halt on any new charter schools.
It's wise. Yes.
Well, I think whether you're pro or con, I believe this about all new things. And not that when I was in the legislature, this is a secret for anyone who's forgotten or didn't know, we had an agreement that we would let there be 8 charter schools so that they could experiment and do things the public schools couldn't do, so the public schools could look at their success or their ingenuity. And of course, that line did not hold. And the public here, and I was talking to a candidate for mayor today. Oh, our school, I'm telling this to you, Elizabeth. Our schools are controlled by the state. The state took them a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
Same as Detroit, because they are a disaster. And
but
on
the
a scale,
state doesn't manage them any better.
well, they're going to manage them worse.
Yeah,
and
that's what happens.
That is not the answer. And I don't want to get into the politics of it, but this is one of the problems of a school system that's 92% Black and brown. And we haven't gone to war to fix them. I don't even understand it. I tried to bring a lawsuit about 2 years ago, and the Supreme Court told me I had no standing. And then I was talking to parents, misunderstanding what the Supreme Court said, that these parents would have standing, and the Supreme Court said, no. Education is a matter for the General Assembly, and the public cannot bring a lawsuit making demands.
Yeah, that's awful.
Where
Other states have been able to do that.
Oh, yes, and I thought we could. I'm not done yet. We have an elementary school in which all the teachers are white. And in the fall, I'm going to bring an action. 67% black and brown, and there are no black or brown teachers, nor
That's
principals.
really crazy. There's a lot of blacks in education. You can't get that result without discrimination.
You and I, yes, and you and I, and this is, I was about to take you there. So when you're a teacher with seniority, you get to go to the best school, which is absurd. And then the schools that need the best teachers have the newest ones and the bad ones.
And huge turnover. So
Correct.
The kids have no stability in the classroom.
None. And there is so much to be done, and we don't do it. And some of it we can't even see. We can't, we've got to, I'm talking too much. Darius?
Okay. The imperative is clear. You've made it compelling, but I worry that the arc wobbles. So equality of dignity, humanism, seems to collide with the inequality of control over oneself and their environment. This seems to be the drag that makes it difficult.
Yeah. So there's absolutely no question that the way progress works is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Okay. There's always people who are afraid of moving forward. And that's why the struggle is continuous. We see this also in the struggle for democracy. And all I can say is, that's why you just have to keep on going. I mean, progress is possible, but it's a long, hard slog. And a lot of it is driven by fear and just totally false beliefs. Just tell you another story. There's a very wonderful economic historian, Gavin Wright, who wrote a book looking at the economic impact of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned racial discrimination, banned segregation of public facilities like restaurants and hotels and buses and so forth. And what he found is that this is the best thing that happened economically to the South, to blacks and whites alike, since the abolition of slavery. There's always this illusion of a pie where if a disadvantaged group gets a bigger slice, that it's taken away from the group on top. But of course, what economics teaches us rather is that there's many, many opportunities for win-win here. And abolishing irrational and unjust discrimination is actually a path for everybody to win. It's hard for people to understand that, but it's really true. And that speaks to the school issue as well. Fully supporting public schools, especially schools where the children are disproportionately disadvantaged, is a huge win for society. Integrating schools is a huge win. Everybody wins. Is it true? White parents think, if there's a lot of black kids in the school, then my kid won't get a good education. It's totally false. This has been done. It is not true. You can keep up school achievement even by abolishing tracking within the school. Tracking does not help children. It just creates conceited kids who are jealous of their privilege. It doesn't make them better people, and it doesn't make them smarter. It's just wrong.
But Elizabeth, I want to tell you, I have a one-man play. I haven't been an actor since I was 16, 17 years old, but I developed this play, and it has about 4 parts. and me in Mississippi being beat half to death by the deputy sheriffs. But my favorite part of the play, in Detroit, this is hard to believe, Black children could not get into college. It was a college, business, and general. And all Black children had to go in general. And you couldn't get in the college lane. You couldn't go to college, you couldn't, in high school, you couldn't study algebra and stuff you needed to go to college unless your parents were college grads. Now, this did not apply to white people, only to Black. And we went into federal court, the ACLU, the NAACP, the Urban League, everybody, Communist Party. We went into federal court, and I was the lead plaintiff in that case. It was so fabulous. And about 2 years ago, it dawned on me I should tell this story. And I've been to about 4 universities here. And my plan is to go to Michigan and Mississippi with this 40-minute one-man play. Now, I share that because this is racism at its ultimate, stopping Black people from going to college.
Yeah.
And the reason for it was we're all supposed to go to the factory. That's what you're Black and you're in Detroit. You're supposed to be a factory worker. And you just can't dream up these things. And then you're luck in having a federal judge who'll side with you. I was just sharing this because this is 40 and 50 and 60 years in the making. And then I see different versions of it here in Providence 50 plus years later. It's just disgusting. I want to vigorously thank you. We're going to let Darius bring one last person for question, but I want to thank you for the bottom of my heart because these discussions are much needed. It's being taped. We'll send it out to about 12,000 people and hope a large number look at it. We'll send it to the 300 people who are with us tonight, and I hope that each of them will share it. At the end of the month, Stages of Freedom has a 2-night program. You go to stagesoffreedom.org. It is the history of the African American church, 1701 to the present in Rhode Island. And it is going to be quite the event, maybe as good as this evening's event.
Well, I want to say I was just completely delighted to have this conversation with you and to be able to address everyone zooming in to this Stages of Freedom event.
So we always end, Darius, you've saved the most exciting person for last.
I guess so. So this last question says, how to address the gentrification issue in integrating neighborhoods of raising taxes as whites move into Black areas and often displace the African Americans, older and on fixed incomes, from being priced out of their residence.
Yeah, that's just a huge problem. And I do think that we need to put in place measures that enable people who've built a community where they live to sustain that community. Maybe some kind of rent control. I'm not sure exactly how to design an appropriate system, but we also have to look overall at the fact that there's not enough housing being built in America. It's especially severe in places like California, where you can't even get like an ordinary bungalow for less than a couple $1 million, right, in the Bay Area. So it's a very serious problem. We used to have significant budget from government for public housing, and we have to really rethink how to rebuild public housing, perhaps, but not on the old basis, but really think it anew.
Good night, all, and blessing on your house, and think about double masking. Good night, everybody.
Good night.